Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us for today's webinar. My name is Mike Lennon. On behalf of Security Week, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join what we think will be a very insightful and interesting webinar today. And that topic is protecting executives and enterprises from digital, narrative, and physical attacks. A little bit different than some of the other webinars you may have attended recently with us, kind of shifting over to that physical side of things. So we've got a great program today. Couple notes before we get started. This will be recorded. You'll be able to watch it on demand, share with colleagues after. You'll get a link shortly, about 10-15 minutes after the webinar completes. You'll get a link to watch it on demand. Additionally, feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get back to you and answer those depending on the time we have. Quick introduction. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then ask them to say a couple words about themselves, and we'll get right into it because we have a lot to talk about today. So first we have Wasim Khaled. He's CEO and co-founder of Blackbird.AI. He's joined by Ed Amoroso, CEO of Tag Cyber, and Chris Pierson, CEO and founder of BlackCloak. So gentlemen, can you just go around the horn here and just do a quick intro and tell us about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So longtime startup guy, but data scientist and computer scientist by trade, and been working on Blackbird AI for about the last 7 years. Look forward to talking about it today.
And hi, everyone. This is Ed. I've been a longtime practitioner, board member, executive, developer. Now I run a research and advisory shop and also teach at New York University. So I'm very happy to be here.
And good morning or afternoon once again. I'm Dr. Chris Pierson. I'm the CEO and founder of BlackCloak. So BlackCloak is digital executive protection, and a career that's spanned multiple different hats: privacy, cybersecurity, outside legal counsel, and a few other things in between. So really looking forward to today's conversation.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Okay, the first obvious question I have here, and to set the tone for the audience and help them understand, and Wasim, I'll direct this to you. What is a narrative attack, and how can it be used to kind of target and harm executives in the companies that they serve in?
Sure. So narrative attack is essentially when there is a deliberate attempt to manipulate public perception through some sort of misleading or distorted false narrative. So unlike a traditional cyber threat that focuses on, say, exfiltration of data or disrupting a system, here the attack is essentially trying to shape how people might think about or perceive a company, an executive, or an issue. If we really think about it from the perspective of executive protection, they are the perfect targets for a narrative attack because their reputations can impact everything from investor confidence to brand trust to employee morale. And so you can imagine if there's an outside actor that has an axe to grind with that executive or that company or just what they represent, a well-placed AI-generated deepfake, a bot network designed to amplify a narrative far beyond what it would have normally done organically. These things can really hit a company, whether it's their stock price, whether it's the triggering of some sort of regulatory scrutiny, or just damaging that executive and that company's reputation almost overnight. And so this is why being able to understand narrative attacks within this larger discipline of narrative intelligence is such an essential layer of security today, because they're no longer just the purview of, say, crisis communications or threat intelligence, but it's a fusion of these disciplines. It's important that technology is being used to surface those kinds of signals.
Okay, thank you. So Chris, this question is for you, and especially over the last year, we've seen some pretty interesting and scary headlines. But when it comes to digital executive protections, what are the significant trends that you see that have kind of changed over the last year? And I think, Wasim, you guys have mentioned that the World Economic Forum had kind of mentioned these digital narrative attacks. Where does that kind of spill over to the digital executive protection, and what sort of activity are you seeing in terms of trends?
Yeah, so I think there are really three main trends of what we're seeing. The first is that there is an absolute convergence that has been happening for really past few years, but really got solidified more in December, which is the convergence between physical security, physical attacks, executive protection, and cybersecurity and privacy, digital executive protection. And I'd say that as a result of the UHC murder of the CEO, Brian Thompson, that what you have there is that total convergence now, and it's for probably 2 decades, but now fully solidified. So that is, how can you go protect your board members? How can you go protect your executives? How can you protect your executive leadership team and C-suite and their families because of the roles they have? How can you protect them in their personal lives? And having information out there on data brokers, right, can actually lead to a physical address, lead to physical harms, as well as having information on their individualized cell phone or their email can lead to cyber attacks. So those two things are becoming very, very more closely related, and so that convergence is 100% there in 2025. That's first. Second, what we see is the family taking and playing a larger role in everything around the topic of digital executive protection. It is totally insufficient to just protect that one executive on the inside of the company. Protecting he or she, that individual, only protects them and their records. But if you can get to the same records, the same information, or that same target, because they're going home each and every night, they're dropping off the kids for school, if you can get to them through a husband, wife, spouse, kid, significant other, then that's what cyber criminals are actually doing, and we're seeing a lot more of. And then third, we're seeing this persistence. So persistent attacks against the individual. So why am I going to go ahead and mount an attack against a well-defended castle that has a 90-foot wall of cybersecurity controls and physical controls, when I can just transition over to the home environment and I can actually go ahead and try to defeat their $5, $50 of cybersecurity or their total lack of physical security. If I can do that, I can, number one, I can loiter for a longer period of time, I can be more persistent, and I can go ahead and use those items to my advantage. And so on digital executive protection, we're seeing a lot more of that, the convergence, the family mattering, and persistent attacks.
Okay, so follow up to that question. So what methods are you seeing that the attackers or threat actors are using to kind of profile and identify their targets?
I mean, it's good old-fashioned open source intelligence. So the OSINT that is being run there, the websites, the About Us leadership pages are leading people right to the fact that Jennifer's the CEO, married to Bob. They have 2 kids, Luke and Leia. They got a dog, Muffy. They volunteer on Saturdays, and you can find them here. They go ahead and do equestrian riding on Sundays at this club. You can see and find a lot of that great information there. You can see it on social media. Second, what we're seeing is that cyber criminals and nation states are actually using and utilizing data brokers to go ahead and do the research. Name, address, telephone number, email address for them, their brothers and sisters, their mom and dad, and their kids, and grabbing in this information. We also see that same method attack on deep web, dark web information, using that which is in breaches. The biggest one, the National Public Data breach, NPD data breach from August of 2024. That had all the raw data out there, date of birth, social security number. Great way to attack on identity theft, great way to attack with real known information. So we're seeing cyber criminals use that publicly available information, use that deep web, dark web information with the information that's been put out about the executives already, and then they're formulating their attacks, and they can literally reach out and touch all the individuals in the family. And as a result, they have a greater chance of getting in, but they're also able to cause a lot more calamity.
Okay. Wasim, I want to go back to you for what you mentioned. One thing about deepfakes and AI. How are you guys seeing the threat actors and nation states using AI to create these attacks? What sort of tools are they openly available? How easy is it? How effective are they? What sort of? I know on the media side we've seen several things in the headlines that CFOs have been duped into wiring money and et cetera. Like what are you guys seeing on your side?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to think about this is we're all kind of living through this this era of using AI generated content and AI reasoning to make our jobs easier, right? I mean, that's what it's all about, is how do you automate workflows and automate efficiencies of scale with the work that you're already doing. So The simplest way to think about it is these threat actors, where we all live in that same ecosystem where access to those tools are readily available. So, if your business is in driving influence campaigns, you're going to utilize those tools to 100x or 1000x your output. So one of the things that worth mentioning here is that when you have foreign adversaries, it's taken away all of these kind of dialect, slang, and cultural challenges, because the LLMs fill in those gaps when they're trying to drive those narratives in a particular region of the world. So that makes it far easier than it used to be, where you'd be able to see all of these tells in the language and the techniques. When it comes to imagery, which is a big piece of an ongoing problem on warped realities and whatnot, those tools are also making massive strides beyond like text. We have, of course, images, videos that are going to make it much easier to be part of a wider influence campaign. So those tools simply accelerating what used to take large teams that were trained to do these types of attacks. You can now use a single person to do the campaigns that would take 100 people to do just a few short years ago. I think the other thing, just picking up a little bit from the discussion on just key things to understand on physical digital convergence, I think it's really important to understand that with these tools now deployed, it's more important than ever to separate what is really happening, so the organic narratives that are spreading from conversations, and engineering of perception shifts. So it just becomes more crucial than ever to differentiate between what's genuinely happening on the ground and then what's being orchestrated in the digital world to create panic or hostility, right? So those are threat vectors that people really weren't looking at before, especially those amplified by narrative attacks, which are designed to then perhaps create a groundswell of I suppose, vitriolic response on a particular industry as a whole, on a particular CEO, based on what their company represents. And that could be based on just general discontent around a population. And that's where you get acts of violence, because there's always that person within there that might elevate above just pure dissatisfaction and take matters into their own hands. And so being able to understand that growing groundswell of perception when it becomes particularly, say, hateful and violent against an entire industry, more important now than ever to understand, and which is why converging these two disciplines, like we are doing with BlackCloak, I think becomes really, really important. Is finding that lead of narrative to when it then broaches the digital space and lands onto the physical world and real world harm.
And just jumping in off of what Wasim said here is, look, the fact of the matter is that we're talking about holistic protection, holistic analysis, holistic response. And that's the key thing, right? What is happening inside the company? What is happening outside the remit of the company in terms of the narratives that are being purveyed about? And what is happening in those executive personnel? And you got to go ahead and grab all those things together. Absolutely all those things together. What we've seen, I think both Wasim and I, what we've seen, especially over the past few months, is that folks want to know, right? They want to know, they want to understand, they want to be able to react, and you have to do so across that entire spectrum. So much more important now than ever.
Okay, thank you guys. So Ed, this question is for you. So all about learning what these attacks are and how they're kind of panning out and what the risks are. We've got all these fancy technologies coming out, and so why can't these large language models and Gen AI systems identify these narrative attacks, easily? You would think, is that easy? Why is this such a challenge?
Well, a lot of the solution will lie in the use of machine and deep learning. There's no question that the ability to process lots of information and context and almost do like for information what we've done in software with bill of materials, getting to the root of where a piece of information comes from. I think that gives you a little glimpse into the types of algorithms that eventually will work here. I mean, that's more for the narrative kind of attack. And it's funny, I work with both Chris and Wasim very closely. Both of them address this sort of human weakness that we make mistakes. Humans make bad decisions. And human beings can go after other human beings, even outside the context of computing, as you'd see in a narrative attack or in a physical attack on another human being. You think of that as being outside the digital realm. So, if somebody wants to come and go after you physically, it's not entirely clear that machine learning is going to do much to help you. But there's a whole infrastructure supporting our day-to-day work, our lives, the things we do, our businesses. And that's kind of what we see at TAG as being, frankly, much greater risk. And the good news is that that is where AI can help. I mean, if we've often thought that, when presented with the potential to either invest more, say, in guards and guns, and bodyguards around your CEO, or in tending a little bit more to their digital life, to their online persona, to the things that they do on social media. Our view is that the return on investment for the latter is much higher. I mean, not to say that you shouldn't protect the CEO physically, but history sort of suggests that that's a very, very difficult thing to do. It's logistically tough. Families don't like it. Executives don't like it. So there are all these things that I think we can do to try to minimize the risk. But ultimately, to your question, generative AI and machine deep learning embedded in algorithms, I think they're going to play a major role in the way we deal with narrative attacks on families and executives, and just this general kind of discipline that sometimes we refer to as digital risk protection. So I'm very bullish on that.
Okay. And a follow-up for you, Ed. I know you guys publish a report, I think a quarterly report. The most recent one that I was reading prior to running this webinar, you mentioned the triangle of protection. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of the three areas that intersect in that area?
Yeah, and Chris and Wasim helped me with that. They were very instrumental in helping shape our thinking. I mean, there's three pieces here. We mentioned physical, so yeah, you do have to worry about that. And digital risk is kind of the whole discussion we're having here. But one thing I will take a moment to point to that I think has an analogy in cybersecurity is threat. So in cyber, Chris, Wasim, all of us, when we're talking about cybersecurity and we talk about threat, we'd say, is there a way to reduce the threat? Is there a way for somehow either through threat intelligence or, outside the scope of sort of the computing part of it, like through negotiation and diplomacy with other countries, can we reduce the threat? The version of that here, for businesses might be a tad uncomfortable because, we wrote it down and I thought long and hard about whether it should be in there. And it's this idea that your narrative as an executive and as a company with your customers, with society, with the community, with other companies, that's a big deal. And having the ethical frameworks in place to be good citizens, to be good community partners, to be ethical to your employees and to your customers, that reduces threat. Your clergyman's going to tell you to do that, but I'm saying it also reduces threat. It's a little uncomfortable because you think, well, really, if you're out there, firing 60, 70% of the people and you're kind of cold and heartless, that increases your threat. I mean, there's any logical analysis of that scenario, it comes to the same conclusion. You're increasing your threat. So being a good citizen, being a good company, being kind to the community and your employees, I don't think we can, just ignore that. That is an important part of this, and it turns down the heat on some of the problems that we've seen. Now, that said, you definitely need Chris and Wasim there to provide backstop because there's always going to be threat. But I do think it's important, as we wrote in our volume, to acknowledge that, I don't think anybody's going after Mother Teresa right now, so I mean, proverbially, and you get the point. So we tried to raise that issue, and we tried to make sure that people understand that is, in cyber, we call that threat reduction. In this area, we call it really being a good citizen.
Yeah, sounds so simple. Just be nice.
You're right.
So Wasim, back to you. What can cybersecurity teams do to proactively protect their executives from these narrative attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to pick up on just something that Ed said here, because you can also do as much as you want to create a good reputation, but an appropriately timed and aimed narrative attack can undo what maybe the marketer spent $50 to $100 billion trying to build, or you spend 10 years building up your reputation in the space. But again, that timing and the state of affairs of like a particular country or the world at that moment can completely derail all that almost overnight. I mean, we've seen companies lose tens of billions of dollars worth of market value over a well-aimed narrative attack. So yes, you can do everything you need to do to be a good company, but it's almost like in today's world, no matter what position you take, because again, narratives are about positions, right? It's what position you're actually taking on the side of the world, right? So you can take position A, and you'll make some of the people happy. You can take position B, you'll make a different group of people happy, right? But that also means that the other half, maybe you're not all that happy. And if you take no decision at all, you stand a good chance of pissing both groups off, actually, because no stance today is the same as making a decision. So when you think about narratives, you actually have to think about it from a perspective of storytelling and framing. Now, in such a fuzzy kind of situation, like these are usually more data-driven in the cybersecurity and category space. They're a little more concrete, right? Now, what can you do? Well, I mean, I would typically go and ask leadership teams, threat intelligence teams, can you do the following, right? As a litmus test, right? So one, do you actually understand where in the ecosystem your narratives are actually growing, your narratives of interest, and how fast they're growing, right? So it's purely like size of narrative. I'm not talking about keyword counts. I'm talking about the evolving complex nuance of narratives, mutations that take place, and how they're growing across different areas of the ecosystem. And remember, some areas of the information ecosystem are much higher risk than others, right? The second is, what is the velocity and the contagion-like spread of those narratives? So you could have a whole bunch of narratives, but when you want to actually understand the risk, you have to understand how quickly it's moving and which groups of the world they're actually supercharging or driving down a particular path, right? So how rapidly is that narrative spreading, almost like a virus, right? And then the third thing is, now that you know the narrative and how fast it's spreading and who it's kind of maybe infecting, do you understand if all of that is synthetic in nature via, say, things like bot networks, or is it just chatter, right? Because if you understand that it's bot networks and it's synthetically amplified, you have a pretty good reason that there is specific intention behind that synthetic amplification, which gives you a whole bunch of things around intent, motives, and response playbooks, right? So as an example, if you're going to have bots amplifying a particular narrative, you're going to think really hard about what kind of decision you want to make when you know that that's not really a human audience behind that reaction. Think boycotts, think shareholder activism, think all manners of things, even calls to violence, are those being driven by bots, right? So if you think like red, orange, green in terms of when you need to be thinking about executive protection or bolstering support, if you're under attack and it's programmatic, there's something behind that. It's a nation state, it's a cyber criminal, it's not just chit chat on the internet, right? So if you can't really understand those three buckets I just mentioned, growth of narrative in different areas, the groups that are being hijacked and how that's spreading, and whether or not it's synthetic, you're actually just completely shooting in the dark when you're trying to make decisions. So this is about observability of tradecraft and decision dominance on the basis of that observability.
Okay. Ed, Chris, you guys want to comment on that?
I'd say I totally agree. Go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead. You got it.
No, I was just going to say, what seems absolutely right. You know, on the narrative attacks are interesting because I'm always looking for analogies to cybersecurity. That's kind of where I grew up. And when you think about the early days when we had, like, a company would have a piece of clean system application infrastructure code, and then some malicious person came along and polluted that with a piece of malware, we went, oh, how do we stop that? How do we pull this malware out of something that was valid, clean, trusted, and now has been ruined in a sense, as Wasim played out. Narrative attacks remind me of that because it may not be software, but it's this discourse that we have, this conversation that we have, this narrative about our company. And in Chris's case, our sort of a persona as an executive. And when somebody comes along and pollutes that, it feels like the same problem. It's different, and the technology's different, and the approach is different. But boy, it sure rhymes with the kind of things we were worried about 30, 40 years ago. So I hope it doesn't take us 30 years to get to the point where this is completely solved. But Chris and Wasim certainly are well on their way here. So maybe we won't have to wait as long.
And Chris, you were going to mention something as well?
I was going to, I think once again, there are a lot of different areas where narrative attacks can be based off of, where you can look back to different things. Way back when, in the early days, was outside counsel practicing intellectual property law. And a lot of what we did was, domain name protection, brand monitoring, brand protection. And everything was always about the value, the worth of the name, the brand, the mark, the logo, what people would, envision in their heads when you mentioned whatever that was. And it was very much of you have to go use it the right way. You have to protect it the right way. You have to educate on it the right way. And you have to protect against cyber criminals doing, typo squatting and other domain name attacks. And you have to be out there ahead of it. And you have to analyze and assess. Are you about to, maybe use eBay as an example or PayPal as an example. Are you about to suffer a massive phishing attack? And you are, because you can see that 1,000 new domain names were just registered in the span of, 2 days, and they're all confusingly similar to the PayPal or eBay name. And so you have some idea of what's happening out there, and you can kind of create a quote unquote, a narrative about what you think may or might happen. And I think that a lot of that, very, very different in terms of what Wasim's talking about, but I think a lot of that is saying it's not just good enough to know that what you've done. It's good to know where you're going. It's good to know what is happening out there outside the wall. It's good to actually provide information and data about that and really motive and intent and understand more about the how and the why and the who, as opposed to out there about X, Y, and Z. Well, who's doing it? What's happening? All the rest. But all of that can be signal to something that is greater in terms of an attack on an individual, an attack on a company, an attack on a brand. And then once again, it's just more important now than ever to bring in those types of pieces of information, that data, into your security operations center, into your GSOC, so you can go ahead and analyze and assess it and decide what to do and decide how worthwhile it is, how important it is, how authentic it is. It could be that it's actually not signal, it's noise.
Okay. So Chris, you actually, I had another question in mind as you're mentioning that about the SOC. So where does this sort of program fit into the normal enterprise? Because at one point we're talking an individual or a series of individuals that we're going to be protecting. Then of course we're protecting the brand. Like where do you guys see the kind of this, if a company were to roll out a program of this sort, like where does that typically fit in? And I understand each organization might be a little bit different, but what do you guys see, like who's implementing this in the enterprise?
So, these programs are currently being owned by the Chief Information Security Officer and the Chief Security Officer. Sometimes they're one and the same. Sometimes the CSO reports in. It just depends. But by and large, we're seeing the programs run there. We're seeing them run there because they involve privacy. They involve cybersecurity and device protection. They involve identity theft. They involve social media takeovers and account takeovers. They involve things that are happening, once again, outside the four walls of the castle that could come back and impact the company, right? If the home of an executive, or when the home of an executive has been compromised or has an issue, well, that corporate laptop might be on that home later that night or that weekend. And so then the company has an issue. There might be personal data that is on the other computers that could be extorted or ransomed, not in terms of, we're not talking about in terms of encryption. We're talking about literally documents and files stolen, trust and estate information, tax information, health information that can be stolen and lifted and then used to target that executive or their significant other or family member. And so those programs are all within that risk area of how do we better protect what is happening outside? How do we better protect what our footprint? How do we protect against financial risks? How do we protect against reputational risks? And so what we see is the CISO and the CSO being the ones in the programs that are owning digital executive protection on the inside of the company. And it should, right? It absolutely should, for a few reasons. Number one, because of all the aforementioned reasons. Number two, because look, when something happens, you want to have a partner. You want to have a partner on the inside of the company. It's the same thing as, it's the same thing as global air travel, air medical rescue, kidnap and ransom policies. A company may implement those as a part of a mitigant, as a part of a control to a high inherent risk that they have, to try to reduce it down to the proper risk appetite. And although it happens outside the forecast walls, there has to be some point of contact on the inside, right? If executive group is over at the Paris Olympics, the physical protection team, the CSO, they're going to be protecting them. They might be sponsoring the Olympics. And as a result, any and all issues that happen at the Olympics could impact the members of the team. They're never off duty. They're always on. And they are the physical, visual representatives of the entire company and brand, and that global trust that they have throughout. So once again, that's where we see the programs, and it's it's meaningful. That's where you get some of the best value, because there's already established processes and procedures on the inside for other threats that happen.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, you'll notice for our viewers, we're just going to throw up a quick poll to keep this interactive. So if you want to take a couple seconds and answer that poll question. The question is, how concerned are you about the convergence of digital, narrative, and physical attacks on executives? So I'll give you a couple seconds to answer that, and then we'll continue to move on to our last couple questions here. All right, well, I know we're short on time, so I'm going to keep going here. So Chris, this is, I know you just talked a little bit about this, but how quickly can these programs be kind of adapted? Obviously some might come on short notice, due to an imminent threat, or something went wrong with a brand and people are scrambling. How quickly can a program like this? It seems pretty comprehensive, but how easy is it to roll out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are three things to consider here. Number one is going to be the speed. So the speed at which you can actually implement the baseline steps and measures of a digital executive protection strategy and platform. And that can be implemented literally for Fortune 100 companies, bringing on 100, 200 executives. That can be done the same day, because that's your data broker removal. That's your deep web, dark web. That's your OSINT. That's the things that can be done beneath or behind the scenes, behind the curtain. And so you can literally implement in live real time that same day. So speed is really, really important. And the benefit is, with BlackCloak, it's a purpose-built solution from the ground up. So you can literally go ahead and start knocking off your risk that same day. Second, I think, is going to be friction, and making sure that whatever you implement there is frictionless. And as it relates to digital executive protection, there are a vast number of items that can be implemented with no executive involvement whatsoever, right? And no involvement of their family either whatsoever. Yes, protecting a device will require some time, right? Downloading of the app, same thing on the computer. But once again, you can go from nothing to something pretty easily and do so in a frictionless manner. So that's super important. And the third point is, you got to go ahead and make sure it's bespoke. Every single board member is going to be different, and they have different personalities. Every executive is different, and they have different personalities. And also, if you know those personalities, the family personality and dynamic could be totally different as well. So when you're thinking about implementing, yep, they can be done immediately. They have to be done with speed. They have to be done in a frictionless manner, and they have to be done in a very, very bespoke manner as well. All of these executives are very busy. Their families are very busy. And so it has to be something that is really, really above and beyond.
Okay. It's good to know. But I assume, like anything, you always continue to make tweaks and enhancements and fine-tune the programs, just like any security program, right?
Every single week, there is some fine-tuning, some tweak. That's the benefit of owning and operating your own platform, right? You can make those changes in response to different things that are happening kind of outside like those castle walls.
Very cool. All right, I want to get a little bit more technical before we wrap up here. So I'll leave this kind of open to all of you guys, but what are some of the technical strategies that help you kind of identify these digital narrative attacks? And is there like certain algorithms or other ways they work together, a little bit more of the nitty gritty when you discover them?
Thing I can jump in with as a kind of a broad, and I know Chris and Wasim will give some more detail, but in our industry, we talk about sort of shifting left, shifting right, that kind of thing. Are you being more preventive? Are you more responding? I think one of the things I like particularly about both BlackCloak and Blackbird is that there's balance across that it's not this lopsided wait and see if something happens and then deal with it. And it's also not one of these prevent it, and if you missed, you're dead. I think that there's a nice balance in both solutions. And I've often said that when people say, should I shift left or shift right? I say yes. I mean, you kind of have to do both. I think this makes perfect sense. Like in our lives, you do the same. You have vitamins, but you also have Band-Aids. You need both. So I think that in the context of, you get a little bit more from Chris and Wasim on their specific algorithms, but keep in mind that if you're wondering, is this a preventive sort of detective or response kind of thing using the NIST framework, it's all of the above. It's both shifting left and shifting right. So that would be the framework I would have in mind as you're trying to solve this problem.
Sure, that's spot on. And I would say, like, when it comes to technical framework for how we think about narrative attacks, that's really what we've been really spending the last 7 years doing really deep tech on, and now productized for about 5 years. But I would say the number one thing is there's really hundreds and hundreds, say actually now into the thousands of AI models that have been built to understand threat actor types. So threat actor types and the TTPs around them, all of the tactics, techniques, all of those things that these threat actors are using are encoded in these models that help understand which threat actor types are actually coming at your organization or executive. And remember, when it comes to something like Blackbird's solution, we're a software as a service deployed product that also can be deployed instantaneously, but we're looking at information from outside the corporate perimeter completely. And sometimes you'll see insider information outside in the information ecosystem as well. But we will ingest all of that data, and the understanding there is using a lot of our AI techniques and our data analysis techniques to understand what I was talking about before, is that notion of the conversation and its growth. I talked about spread, like the infection-like spread. What that really is big graph network analysis at really unprecedented size compared to what had been done previously. So while other companies have been doing in the hundreds and thousands of nodes to understand all of those interactions between the conversation points, we do in the millions of nodes. So we understand much higher resolution around that synthetic amplification. One thing everyone should understand is if anyone tells you can do bot network analysis without actual big graph network analysis, there's a problem, right? So being able to see all of those signals requires quite a bit of technology underpinning, as well as some of our deepfake analysis that requires a lot of technology that is designed to understand a lot of the algorithms that are building synthetic media to be able to understand not only if something is synthetic media, but then what is the spread of that piece of synthetic media in the information ecosystem. When you roll this all up, you end up with an alert and decision-making system that enables you to see not only what the narrative is, but how harmful it is to you as an organization and what you might need to do to get ahead of it. But yeah, quite a bit of IP going into this. I think the old world used to think about keyword mentions and sentiment. This is a completely different animal altogether. And it is, again, narrative intelligence and understanding of narrative attacks.
Okay. Well, after we have discussions like this, I always like to kind of end on, the path forward. And what is the path forward here? I know you guys are trying to tackle this problem. Is it really solvable? There's always going to be some inherent risk, I assume. Where do you guys see this, and how effective is it, and is it solvable?
Yeah, I mean, it's 100%. This is absolutely a problem that can be tackled, is being tackled, and should be tackled in terms of digital executive protection, right? Absolutely. Will you be able to move it right, from whatever risk point you're at to a zero-sum risk area? No, there's nothing that will ever be a zero risk. But are you able to put it into a risk appetite that is much more adaptable, much more amenable to the CISO, to the CSO, to the board, to the executive risk committee, to the executive committee? The answer is yes, absolutely. And you can see real results in terms of mitigating and shrinking that attack surface from a privacy perspective. You can see real results of actually defending devices so they don't have malware on them, defending homes so that they are more impenetrable, and actually hardening the human through the use of a very, very concierge team, but once again, done in a very bespoke manner. So, I mean, as it relates to digital executive protection, yes, absolutely, right? It's like if you're standing still on this topic, executives being hit. We had, a study came out in June of 2023, something of 46% of CISOs are actually seeing attacks on their executives and in their personal lives. And that's just who reported. There's probably another 20% that didn't know, weren't told. And so if you extrapolate that out, it's like 2/3 of the executives are actually having something happen, and who knows for their family members. So this is something that's happening and something that's very, very able to mitigate in this day and age.
Yeah, I would also say, from our perspective, solvable is really about getting, again, observability and getting ahead of the problem, right? And much like cybersecurity has always been, it's a bit of a cat and mouse game between your offense and defense, right? So in almost all forms of warfare, whether it's kinetic warfare, cyber warfare, or information warfare, I would say that defense has always trailed offense, but then you have to continually escalate here the technologies and deployment strategies for resilience. I think that's why the complementarity of what BlackCloak and Blackbird are doing are so critical right now at this juncture, because again, we're not talking about just protection inside the enterprise. We're really ensuring that executives, their families are safeguarded beyond that corporate perimeter, not only in the kind of traditional digital infrastructure, but in this more fuzzy information ecosystem. And so I think this is becoming an operational necessity. And I think CISOs and security teams will see that there are actual technical solutions that are out there for problems that maybe they thought weren't really solved via technology, but now are.
All right, Wasim, thank you very much. We are just about out of time, but I want to thank you gentlemen for your time today, Wasim, Chris, and Edward. And I want to thank our viewers for tuning in today. We hope you found it informational. And you'll also notice the resources in the webinar player. Feel free to engage with those resources and learn a bit more. And gentlemen, thank you very much, and hope we can continue this conversation at some point.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.